You sleep, you rest, you even slow down when you can, and still, you remain tired. It is not a kind of tiredness that prevents you from functioning. You wake up, work, handle what needs to be handled, answer messages, keep your routine going. From the outside, everything looks reasonably organized. Life moves on without major disruptions. There is no obvious crisis, no collapse in sight, nothing that, on its own, explains this constant wear. Even so, there is a persistent sense of fatigue, a feeling that your energy never fully returns, as if you were always operating slightly below your own baseline. This tiredness is not dramatic. It does not shout. It does not interrupt. It does not paralyze. It simply accompanies you, silent, continuous, almost too discreet to be taken seriously. You manage to do everything you need to do, but you feel that everything takes a bit more effort than it should. Thinking feels more tiring. Deciding feels heavier. Sustaining attention seems to require more energy than before. What makes this experience especially confusing is the fact that, in theory, you are doing the right things. You sleep enough. You rest when you can. You are not obviously overextending yourself. And still, you wake up without a real sense of recovery. Rest happens, but it does not seem to fully do what it is supposed to do. That is where the paradox appears. You are doing fine, but you do not feel fine. You are resting, but you do not feel restored. This kind of tiredness is often quickly normalized. You keep going because you can. You learn to live with a mind that always feels a little heavy, with slightly reduced clarity, with the constant sense that something is always running in the background. Because it does not stop you from functioning, it starts to feel like a natural part of adult life, as if being constantly tired were simply the cost of being responsible, productive, and mentally active. Over time, this fatigue becomes background noise. It stops drawing attention and begins to subtly shape daily experience. Patience shortens. Interest scatters more quickly. Inner space feels smaller. Everything keeps working, but with less margin. What is most unsettling is that there is no specific event to blame. Nothing clearly went wrong. Nothing spun out of control. There was no recent extreme effort that would justify this state. And precisely because of that, the experience becomes hard to name. You feel the effect, but you cannot point to an obvious cause. Many people interpret this tiredness as a lack of motivation, laziness, or even personal failure. Others believe they need to rest more, sleep more, push themselves less. But even when they do that, the feeling remains. The body may respond, but something seems to stay active in the background. This difference between being physically rested and mentally recovered is rarely examined with care. The body stops, but the mind does not always follow. And as long as this distinction goes unnoticed, the tiredness remains a silent puzzle. You are not exhausted in the classic sense, but you are not renewed either. This in-between state, functional and tired at the same time, is more common than it seems. It does not indicate collapse or fragility. It simply suggests that something is happening beyond visible physical effort. Something subtler, more continuous, that cannot be resolved by sleep or pause alone. Understanding this paradox is the first step towards seeing tiredness differently, not as a personal error, but as a sign that the rest you have been offering may not be reaching exactly what most needs to be restored. When the day ends, tasks stop, work winds down, obligations decrease, the external pace slows. You get home, sit on the couch, lie down, try to relax. The body responds quickly, posture shifts, muscles release, breathing becomes slower. Everything suggests that rest has begun, but something does not follow. Without you noticing, the mind stays active. Not intensely, not agitated, not dramatically. It keeps running in a light, almost discreet way, but constantly. Small thoughts appear, loose ideas surface, scenes from the day are replayed, future situations are imagined without real urgency. None of this seems important enough to justify fatigue, yet all of it keeps attention engaged. This is the central point that often goes unnoticed. Physical rest is not the same as mental recovery. Rest removes tasks. It interrupts external actions. It reduces visible stimulation. but it does not automatically interrupt internal processing. The mind does not receive, along with rest, a clear signal that it can stop monitoring. It simply loses its main object. During the day, attention has a destination. There are concrete demands, clear problems, defined tasks. Even if this is tiring, there is focus, there is direction, there is closure. When those demands end, attention does not dissolve, it becomes unanchored. And attention without a destination rarely comes to rest. It begins to move on its own, jumping from thought to thought, following ideas with no immediate importance, observing its own mental flow. Not because there is a problem, but because the system continues operating in the mode it was trained to operate in. At the end of the day, this shows up in simple ways. You try to rest, but you feel that something keeps running inside. There is no clear anxiety, no obvious tension. There is just continuity, a mental background that does not switch off. On weekends, this becomes even more noticeable. You finally have free time, no deadlines, no pressure. The body slows down, but the mind wanders. It reviews the week, anticipates future commitments, mentally organizes details that do not require action right now. Everything feels light, but nothing really ends. The result is a kind of activity that does not register as effort. You do not feel like you are forcing your mind. It is simply on, and precisely because it does not feel like effort, this functioning goes unnoticed. But that is where the problem lies. Because mental energy is not drained only by intense effort. It is also drained by continuous activity, even at low intensity, especially when there are no real pauses between one thought and the next. Physical rest creates external silence. It reduces stimulation. It gives the body a break. But in that silence, internal movement becomes more audible. And without a clear destination, attention begins to occupy whatever space is available, including your own thoughts. That is why many people rest and still do not feel recovered. The body stopped, but the mind kept monitoring. There was no energetic collapse. There was a constant leak. This way of functioning is not a sign of personal failure. It is predictable. The human mind evolved to observe, anticipate, organize, maintain a certain degree of control. When there is nothing external demanding this, it does not simply shut down. It redirects focus, and as long as that focus remains active, even subtly, recovery does not complete itself. Rest happens, but it does not reach what is still running. That is why sleep does not always solve it. That is why stopping does not always restore. Not because you're resting incorrectly, but because what consumes the most energy is not always interrupted when the body stops. This continuous functioning carries a cost that is almost never noticed as it happens. There is no peak of effort, no clear warning sign. What exists is a silent, cumulative wear that gradually forms while life appears to go on as normal. The mind remains in a state of constant monitoring. Even when there is nothing urgent to observe, it keeps tracking thoughts, checking possibilities, reviewing small details. These are almost automatic microprocesses, done without conscious intention, but repeated all the time. Each one consumes a fraction of energy. On its own, it seems insignificant. Added together over the course of a day, a week, a month, they create real fatigue. That is why many people feel more tired on light days than on truly busy ones. On busy days, there is focus. Attention locks onto clear tasks. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even if it is tiring, there is closure. When a task ends, something closes with it. On empty days, the opposite happens. Attention disperses. It spreads across small thoughts, loose ideas, mild worries, irrelevant memories, low urgency anticipations. Nothing is large enough to fully capture focus, so everything gets a little attention. This prolonged dispersion is especially draining, not because it requires intense effort, but because it offers no real rest. The mind never goes deep enough into anything to close it. It just moves. It is like being in constant motion without direction, and motion without direction consumes energy without producing a sense of progress. This kind of wear is hard to identify because it is not accompanied by classic signs of effort. You do not feel like you are working too much. You do not feel muscle tension. You do not feel intense emotional pressure. You feel a diffuse heaviness, a fatigue that shows up at the end of the day without a clear cause. Often, this tiredness appears as difficulty focusing, mild irritability, loss of clarity, or the feeling of a crowded mind. Small decisions start to require more effort. Thinking becomes tiring more quickly. Sustaining attention becomes harder. None of this happens abruptly. It accumulates. The problem is that because you keep functioning, this cost goes unnoticed. You adapt. You learn to operate with less margin. You begin to see it as normal to always feel a little mentally tired. This constant monitoring also creates the impression that the mind never truly rests. Even when you stop, something continues inside. There is no real silence, only short gaps between thoughts. And the longer this pattern persists, the harder it becomes to notice it. The wear turns into background noise. It does not call enough attention to be questioned, but it influences everything. This is the invisible wear of continuous functioning. It does not come from a single overload, but from the sum of many small mental activities that never close. It is not a lack of rest, it is a lack of real interruption. As long as this pattern goes unrecognized, tiredness continues to be interpreted as something personal, as if it were a sign of weakness, lack of motivation, or inability to relax. And that interpretation adds even more weight to an already tired system. Understanding this invisible cost does not solve everything immediately, but it shifts perspective. It begins to reveal that tiredness does not come only from what you do, but from how attention remains active even when there is nothing that requires it. When tiredness is seen through this lens, something important shifts internally. It stops feeling like a personal defect and starts to be understood as a logical effect of a mode of functioning that stayed active for too long. Not because you did something wrong, but because the mind remained in continuous operation even when the body stopped. This reframing is subtle but deep. It removes blame. You are not tired because you are weak. You are not tired because you do not know how to rest. You are not tired because you lack discipline or motivation. You are tired because attention stayed on for too long, without real pauses, without clear closures. And active attention consumes energy, even when there is no obvious effort. When this becomes clear, the relationship with tiredness changes tone. It stops being an enemy to fight or a problem to eliminate quickly. It becomes a coherent signal of continuous use, something that makes sense within a larger logic. This shift in interpretation alone already lifts part of the weight, because much of the suffering around mental fatigue comes from how it is judged, from internal pressure, from the idea that you should be different from how you are. When this layer of self-judgment is removed, something softens. The mind no longer needs to defend itself. It no longer needs to prove efficiency all the time. It no longer needs to constantly try to function better. This does not mean tiredness disappears immediately, nor that the mind automatically slows down. It simply means that inner conflict decreases, and less conflict also consumes less energy. Mental clarity, in this context, is not a permanent state of lightness. It is not waking up every day feeling refreshed and full of energy. Clarity is often just understanding what is happening without fighting it. When you understand why rest does not always restore, why energy does not fully return, why empty days can be more tiring than busy ones, the experience changes texture. It becomes more intelligible, less confusing, less threatening. You may still feel tired at times, but you no longer feel wrong for it. That difference matters more than it seems. Because feeling tired is one thing, feeling inadequate for being tired is something else entirely. The first is a human experience. The second adds unnecessary weight to something that is already difficult. As this understanding settles in, even gradually, the mind stops spending so much energy trying to fix itself. It does not need to prove anything. It does not need to be different from what it is in that moment. This reduction in inner tension alone already changes how tiredness is experienced. It still exists, but it takes up less emotional space. It does not dominate the experience. It does not define who you are. A tired mind begins to be seen as a mind that has been active for too long, not as a defective one. And this shift in perspective changes how you live inside your own head throughout the day. None of this is a quick solution. None of this is a promise. It is simply a more honest understanding of how the human mind works. And very often, it is exactly this understanding that creates the conditions for something to begin reorganizing naturally. Not through effort, not through control, but through clarity. When tiredness stops being a hostile mystery and starts to make sense, it loses some of the power it had. It is still there, but it no longer carries the same load of frustration. And perhaps that is what it means, in a realistic and adult way, to begin recovering, not as a sudden event, but as a quiet shift in how you perceive, interpret, and live your inner experience. From that point on, the mind no longer has to fight against its own functioning. It can, little by little, find more space simply by no longer being in conflict with itself.